Well, it's that big day of the year coming. Thousands of young people in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, A-level results day. And for students, for their parents, that age-old question, what next, and is university worth it? Well, today on the Daily Tea, I'm joined by Camilla Turner, Sunday Telegraph political editor, and actually, more vitally for this conversation, former education editor. Welcome, Camilla, to the Daily Tea.
Hi, great to be here. And we'll also be discussing today Ukraine. Has Volodymyr Zelensky turned the tables on Vladimir Putin? We've got our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, who will be bringing us the latest. Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Turner.
And me, Kamal Ahmed. Is university worth it? It's become part of the big debate ever since the huge expansion of higher education, in particular under the 1997 Labour government. What's your take on where that debate sits at the moment?
Well, I think it's a huge question, not least for all of the thousands of students who tomorrow are going to be picking up their A-level grades and deciding on their next steps. Have they made the cut for university? Will they go into clearing? Will they change course completely? And I think, in recent years, we've had such a major expansion of the university sector, more and more students going to university each year. I think it was in 1999 that Tony Blair made his big pledge that he wanted to get 50% of the country's young people going to university, which at the time seemed crazy, but it was back in 2018 that actually came to fruition. But I think now the big question is that the right thing? Is it the right thing for young people that so many are going to university and getting saddled with debt for the best part of 30 years afterwards? And is it the right thing for the taxpayer to essentially be underwriting the cost of all these students going to university? Because if they're not able to pay back their degree, ultimately it gets written off and passed on to the taxpayer. So I think some big questions for both young people and also for the university sector as a whole.
If I take a step back and think about when I went to university right at the end of the 1980s, so many fewer young people went to university, and frankly, they were from middle-class backgrounds. I went to a comprehensive school in West London. The type of people who went to university were from really, in the main, a certain type of economic background. I've always been a really big supporter of more higher education, younger people staying in good courses, but being able to have that higher education experience, not just for the jobs they could go into, but for the experience of going away, leaving their family home, having the university experience, learning about learning. I think that is really important. The 50% target has led to more social mobility. I mean, you go to any of, sometimes they're quite criticised, but you go to any of the newer universities and they are very, very different from the universities that maybe we went to, or you're younger than me, Camilla, when I went to university, universities were still that slight preserve of a certain type of person. So I'm a huge supporter of university expansion, but you're quite right. There has been this issue about the quality of what students have been given, and the Office for Students has done a lot of research into lots of students feeling they're just not getting enough face time, particularly since COVID, where still a lot of universities are doing online learning. Is it really the experience that people are paying many thousands of pounds a year for? Looking back at some of the history of this, I stumbled across a piece. It was in 2010 when the first really big question marks, as they got towards that 50% expansion, about is it worth it? Are employers getting what they need out of it? And there was a quote from the president of the National Union of Students. I just wrote this quote down, and he said, "It is in the long-term interest of our economy that the number of highly skilled graduates entering our workforce continues to increase." And then that person was Wes Streeting, who is now the health secretary. So there's this whole cohort of young people who grew up through the Labour era of 97 to 2010, which was all about expansion, something which I still feel I really support. And they are now in government. So you've changed from this much more critical tone of the Conservatives, Micky Mouse courses, universities in financial trouble, over-expansion, not connected enough to good employment. has changed, I'm imagining, into back to that slight Labour tone of we need to have more younger people going through university.
I think that's right. But I think at the same time, one of the big themes of this Labour government is trying to save money and trying to get the country's finances back on track, because we're not in a good place at the moment. And I think if you're looking around the public sector and seeing where the kind of largesses and seeing which parts of it haven't had cuts, really going back to the austerity era, back to 2010, a lot of people see the university sector as a sort of, it does receive a lot of public funding as well as other sources. So it's part of the public sector, but one that really hasn't been reined in. It's actually had massive expansion at a time when other parts of the public sector have had to tighten their belts. So I do think it's an area where if you're looking at your spreadsheets and you're looking at the finances, is it actually somewhere you might want to reel in a bit? And with us to discuss some of these thorny issues, we're very lucky to have Rob Halfon, the former Minister for Higher Education, Skills and Apprenticeships.
Hi, Rob. Thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea. Rob, you stood down at the last election, and I know you still maintain a keen interest in education. I'm interested just to know, when you were Education Minister, what was the attitude to higher education and higher education expansion? Were you someone who thought it had gone too far, needed to be changed? Was the department in that mood state? I just wondered if you could explain to me what it was like being a minister in this department in terms of the attitude to universities.
Well, what was interesting was that the Prime Minister combined the briefs. So previously there had been a separate Higher Education Minister and a separate Apprenticeship and Skills Minister. And I was very glad for that, because what the policy of the government, and something I passionately believed in, was to inject more skills into the higher education system and make sure that university was as much focused on outcomes and building up the skills needs of the nation as well as the skills needs of the students as it was on getting a good education, having that experience of going to university. And I thought that was quite important. And there was a huge focus on outcomes, which is why the government suggested that the OFS, for example, focused on regulation and limiting recruitment to those courses that had poor outcomes. And it's why there was a huge investment into degree apprenticeships, because I think there are huge challenges facing our universities. And I think that whilst there are fantastic universities, and I visited them all over the country, and they do incredible things, I still think the university system is very similar to what it was when I was a student, and that was, 30 odd years ago. It's and we're now in a kind of, they're still operating as if it's a black cab world when we're actually in an Uber world. And so there are big challenges coming down the line, and I'm happy to talk to you about them. But there was a big focus on skills and outcomes, and I think that was right.
And just to explain to the listeners, you mentioned the OFS, so that's the Office for Students, the university watchdog that was set up sort of relatively recently, wasn't it, to try and keep the sector in check. I wanted to ask, we've had massive expansion of the numbers of students going to university in recent years, ever since the government lifted the cap on numbers. Do you think we now have too many students going to university?
Well, look, when my father came here as an immigrant, he started off with nothing but did well, but his whole attitude was education, you're going to go to university. So, of course, I was very proud to go to university myself. I absolutely had the greatest time of my life at Exeter University. But what I think was wrong was that for a number of years there was an emphasis on numbers going in, quantity, rather than quality of outcome. And I think that the mantra from Blair and some other politicians was university, when it should have been skills. And we should have promoted apprenticeships and other skills offerings as much as we were promoting university, and I think that still stands to this day. So whilst of course we're proud that record number of students are going into university, there are still too many graduates going to university and not necessarily getting good skilled jobs when they come out. Whereas if you compare someone who completes an apprenticeship, over 90% of those students who complete an apprenticeship get good skilled jobs in the company or organisation that has employed them. So I think we really need to have a renewed focus on skills and outcomes for our university. And also, as I say, we've got a number of challenges coming down the line, and university over the next 20, 30, 40 years could be radically different because of a number of policies and a number of things that are happening on the educational landscape.
Does that mean fewer students? Just to build on what Camilla asked, does that mean fewer students, or actually there should be fewer universities? Fewer students.
Well, I don't think it means either. I think obviously you want people to have the choice because some people are more academically inclined and prefer that academic environment. But what you want to do is ensure that people have good skilled jobs when they come out. And that must be, to me, as well as, of course, the research, which is very important, but the primary purpose of going to university. And if you look at the challenges, that are facing universities, they are huge. So you have what I call the disruptor universities, like the Dyson University, which has a university on its campus. You could get many more of those in the future. Just imagine having a British Museum University where people studied but worked at the British Museum at the same time, and it was on the British Museum campus, for example. You've also got the new institutes of technology, which provide tertiary education, higher technical qualifications. There's about 21 of those around the country. Students will go to those. Then another challenge is the lifelong learning entitlement, because people from about 2026, this was a bill that I brought through Parliament, will be able to do short courses or modules of courses and be able to move from institution to institution at the time of their choosing. So they won't necessarily have to go to university for 2, 3, 4 years. So that will change behaviours as that slowly rolls out. You've also got the AI that's going to change teaching and the way students interact with university as well. You've got the degree apprenticeships as a disruptor. And my own dream would be that around 50% of students would be doing degree apprenticeships. So you get a bit of university experience, you get a quality apprenticeship, but you get a good skilled job, and you don't even have to take out a loan at all. So it's a great option for students. And then, of course, the other challenge is the OFS regulation, which, looking at things like making sure that there are good courses, and if there are too many students going on courses that have poor outcomes, then you limit recruitment to those courses. I think that is a good thing.
And I wanted to also ask you, Rob, do you think we still have a problem with the so-called Micky Mouse degrees? So in other words, degrees that are essentially a bit pointless and just leave students saddled with a load of debt and unable to really find a job when they finish?
Yeah, I never liked that phrase, and I never used it because I felt that it insulted, it became a kind of watchword. And when you think of those students who work really hard to get into university, and I think of my own father who, pushed and pushed and pushed me. God help me if I got a bad school report, by the way, when I was growing up, but pushed and pushed me to go to university. So I don't like that term. What I do think the way to solve that is to have a resolute, ruthless focus on outcomes. And to be honest, I'm open-minded about what the course is, as long as the students are getting good skilled jobs at the end. And if they're not, then the taxpayer shouldn't be subsidising it or funding it. And, if people want to pay for these kind of courses privately, that's a matter for them. But if the state is to be involved, it is right for the state or the government to have a strategic view to say, these are our skills needs. We want to ensure that students who are taking out big whacking loan get good jobs, and therefore it's right that the regulator, the OFS, takes control of those courses and limits the kind of numbers who can go on those courses, or even an extreme case shuts them down.
Completely with you.
But I think we have to be very careful about using that term, because it is an insult to everyone who comes over as an insult to everyone who works hard to go to university and has a wonderful experience. And so I never used that. I never liked that, and I thought it was wrong that we did it.
Mr. Halfon, I'm right with you, I must admit, on the term Micky Mouse degrees. But let's talk about the standard of degrees. You said that there are a number of challenges for universities. I think they've come under two big blocks. There's the financial challenge that the expansion of universities meant, can they still fund the systems they've put in place with all the new buildings, all the new ways they operate, given that there is a decline in international students coming here who bring in more money to the universities. There's actually a decline in actual numbers of students year by year as the school roll starts to decline. And then there's the actual standard of the courses that they offer. So let's just talk about the finances initially. What is the challenge on the financial footing that so many universities are on? We hear of so many universities that are in such budgetary distress. They're almost like the local councils, aren't they? Where they've borrowed too much or they've taken on too many students that they can't afford, or they have too many staff who they can't afford to support. What do you think the risks are and the challenges are there on the finances?
Well, I think that this is a very difficult issue. It's the elephant in the room. I said there are a number of challenges, and of course that's a kind of big elephant in the room that covers all these challenges. I think that we look at this the wrong way, because what I think we need to do is work out. Personally, I'd have either a Royal Commission or a big a review like the Alga review, which looked at FE, and Alga was, in my view, one of the most transformative people on skills in this country over the last 20 years, given what he has done for FE and the lifelong learning entitlement, Philip Alga. But what I would do is have a review, first of all, as to what kind of university system we want for the 21st century, for the next 50, 100 years, to look at all the challenges, some of which I've mentioned to you. And once you've done that, then you work out how to pay for them. Now, if you look at the current situation, why is it that some universities that are run brilliantly don't have deficits? So you take Nottingham Trent University, or as a vocational university, or take Exeter University, for example, my old university, or many others around the country that do really well, that don't have these same financial challenges. And why is it that others are having very great difficulties? Is it because they've expanded too much? Is it because they've opened too many offices overseas? Is it because of bad management? I don't know those answers, but I do think that universities should specialise more. I don't think that every university needs to have such a wide variety of courses, and I think it would be much better if some universities were known as specialist for STEM, or some universities would be specialist for the creative, cultural, and focused on a more narrow courses. But nevertheless, I accept there are financial challenges, but who is going to come along and say to my former constituents, yes, we're going to increase your tuition fees? Right? It's something that I would be very reluctant to do. I think universities should do more to look for private sources of income. I think they have to be careful in terms of the amount of expansion they do. But where there are deep-seated challenges, of course, the governor's got to look at that. But as I say, we only solve this problem in the long term. You can't solve this problem with just a kind of dollop of aid here and there, of financial support. When something goes rough for a university, you have to look at what the challenges are facing universities, look at what kind of system we want, and have a brilliant person, Royal Commission, or a brilliant person like Alga lead a review, and then say, this is how we're going to fund it all. So that's the way I would respond to that. And just finally, it is worth remembering that if you include the research grant, universities do get £40 billion roughly a year. If you include the research, that's everything. That's their own income they raise. That's international students. That's subsidised loans, the government grants from the strategic policy grant, and so on. So if you compare that to further education, there is no comparison. Further education gets nothing like that. And you don't get people in the House of Lords or whatever it is getting up every 5 minutes in the newspapers saying we need more money. Right? And actually, FE, if I had limited funds, if I could do anything, I would rebalance the system and fund further education in a much bigger way, because further education is truly transformative and does huge amounts to help the disadvantaged students climb the ladder of opportunity.
And you talked about the importance of outcomes for university courses. I mean, as things stand, do you think we do have some courses at universities around the country where the standard is simply not up to scratch and students are just being let down by the sort of quality of degree they receive?
Well, of course, look, it's not for me to say that, but if you just look at the OFS are investigating a number of courses, and then there are a number of league tables that you can look at. and you'll see those courses, and those courses have poor outcomes. Now, when I raised all this in the past, everybody thought that it was an attack on creative courses. And that is completely not the case, because you've got some universities where students will be doing art subjects, English or whatever, having brilliant outcomes, and other universities where they're doing those subjects and getting poor outcomes. And the same with STEM subjects. There are some universities where students leave doing and don't get good outcomes, and some that get much better. So this is not an attack on the arts. You know, I regard surprise, surprise, I did a politics degree and an MA in politics, but some people call that a science. I regard it as an art, but I'm very supportive of the arts and creative subjects. They are as important to our economy as the STEM. This is not about just making everyone do STEM subjects as adults. Although of course we do have big deficits in those areas, and we need to, and in medicine we do need to encourage as many students as possible to do them.
And some universities are reportedly very close to financial ruin. You talked about the huge financial pressures the sector faces. If a university actually does go bankrupt and basically fail, do you think the government should intervene to save it, or do you think it should just be left to sort of run its course?
Well, I think the problem with just closing universities, it affects, thousands and thousands of students and staff, and I think that is very difficult. So I think these things have to be judged on a case-by-case basis, and it may be that the government gives them an emergency loan, but there have to be changes. You'd have to ask why the leadership of that university got themselves into such financial trouble, what that university did, what reforms that university would do. So in urgent situations, of course, I would accept state intervention. You can't just let a university fold because of the impact on students. But having said that, you'd have to have a real management plan and a change in leadership. And that's why I go back to my original point, is that we have to have a kind of review on what universities are for, what we expect of universities, what they should be teaching, what they should be doing, and then work out how it's going to be funded. We can't just keep coming up with an elastoplast to kind of solve every problem as it comes up. And usually that elastoplast, of course, costs taxpayers money.
Now, Robert, I can't let you go without asking, what's it like not being an MP, and what are you going to do next?
So I have huge cold turkey. I'm missing it massively, although I'd done both being a candidate and as well as MP, it amounted to about 25 years, close to 25 years. So it was time for me to go. But subject to a COBA, the Government Committee on Business Appointments, I'm hoping from September to do a number of roles in education and skills, because that is my passion. So I want to, my first speech in Parliament was about apprenticeships, my maiden speech. I ended my final speech in Parliament, I talked about apprenticeships and skills, and my passion is to continue this, albeit not in Westminster, but to promote an education, apprenticeships and skills across the board, especially in our universities.
Now, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky. Who do you think should be the next leader of your great party?
So I've backed Mel Stride, because I think we have the most important commodity in politics is trust. So the public lost trust with the Conservatives, and I think he comes over as both trustworthy and affable. And now, just because you're likable does not necessarily mean you're a weak person. You can be a conviction politician and principled and tough, but actually be likable. And I think that we need more wisdom than populism. And I think we need to show a likability with the public, because if you look at the man in the street, they currently think they don't like the Conservatives. We sound angry and shouty. We campaign for the negative when we should campaign for the positives. And so that's why I realise that he's the underdog in this race, but as was Cameron, funnily enough, way back in 2005. But I think that he's demonstrated conviction, because he did huge welfare reforms, saving billions of pounds, very controversial, but made sure they didn't become politically toxic. I felt he did a lot in the election by, doing loads of media appearances, and I thought that was impressive, given everyone else sort of declined to do them. And I feel that he comes over as a likeable and trustworthy person, and I think that is huge. He's also very exciting on party reforms, because just as there's a lack of trust with the country and the Conservatives, there's also a lack of trust with the party members and CCHQ. And he wants to democratise the party, provide proper membership services, end all the kind of cronyism, ensure meritocracy, a genuinely meritocratic party. So I think it's quite exciting, some of the things that he's saying. And I just think it's right for me to support the person who may not be the front runner, but who I feel closely aligns to my kind of worldview in life.
So it's been reported that this year universities are expected to let in even more students than usual who simply don't make their A-level grades. Is that a sort of trend that you're concerned by?
I think this is a really difficult one, because I want people to have the opportunities, and exams are very tough. I mean, when I was never good at exams as a child, in fact, I was terrified. And I was, lived in anxiety days and days before I got my A-level results. And people do have bad days, even though they may have worked hard all year. So would you really want to destroy the chance of someone going to university if they've had a bad day and maybe got a slightly worse grade, got a C in one subject when they were supposed to get a B or whatever it might be? I think you also have to ensure you maintain standards. But I have less of a problem if universities take on people, as long as it isn't just about filling the class, there's numbers of seats. So and it isn't just about raising fees, and they're also put on good courses that give them good skilled outcomes. But I would also encourage, as a fanatical evangelist of degree apprenticeships, my two favourite words in the English language, I would encourage every student who may not have got the grades to think about applying. You can do it via UCAS now. It's completely changed. I worked with UCAS when I was apprentice minister to bring that through. You can apply for degree apprenticeships via the UCAS website. And it's an incredibly exciting thing to do. And you don't have to take up a loan. You earn while you learn, some decent money, and you get a good skilled job. So it's a no-brainer. And you can do them in everything from aeronautical to zoology, with nursing, policing in between. I think there are many, many subjects you can do in degree apprenticeships, and it's properly funded. There's a 40 million fund from the government to support degree apprenticeships, which we brought through. So I would think, if you don't get your place, think about applying for an apprenticeship or higher apprenticeship or a degree apprenticeship, because it should change your life.
Thank you, Rob. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Well, Camilla, what a nice guy Robert Halfon is. We slightly forget that there were many, many ministers who did great work despite the punishment of the electorate on election day. People like Rob are a real loss.
Yeah, he's a great guy, and he's been for basically his entire parliamentary career just flying the flag and beating the drum of skills and apprenticeships. So, gotta respect a guy for kind of coming in and really making something his own.
I thought a couple of really interesting points he made. The idea of disruptive universities. I've been down to that Dyson University in Wiltshire. James Dyson, obviously famous for the new vacuum cleaner, but obviously a very well-known engineer and makes many, many other things as well now. And that university is an incredible environment for, we have far too few engineers in this country. And that was it's a spectacular campus that Dyson's business has and Dyson himself has supported. And also these degree apprenticeships, which until we did the research for this podcast, and obviously, Camilla, you will know, given your expertise about them, but this idea of working and learning, I found quite exciting as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I wonder if students coming through thinking more pragmatically about what do they want to get out of university, if what the end result is a job, but if they can be qualified for that job vocationally as well as get a degree, that does seem like a pretty good option, I think. And it'll be interesting to see if they increase in popularity, because they're relatively new. But if, as they become more established, if more and more students do actually opt for that.
Well, we'll watch what Rob Halfon does next, and hopefully we can get him back on the Daily Tea podcast. Stay with us, because we're going to be talking about Ukraine next and the remarkable insurgence into Russia by Ukrainian forces.
Welcome back. Now, Ukraine is back in the headlines once again, and just today, a second border region in Russia has declared a state of emergency after Ukraine began bombarding it early on Wednesday. I might need to ask for your help on pronouncing this.
We're going to bring in Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent, slightly earlier. Roland, I believe you are a Russian speaker, but we've been slightly struggling with this name, haven't we, Camilla? He's the governor of the region that has been the latest to declare this state of emergency. But Camilla, kick it off with your attempt, and then we'll get Roland's effort.
I'll give it a go. The situation in our Belgorod region remains extremely difficult and tense due to the shelling from the Ukrainian armed forces. Houses are destroyed, civilians have died and were injured. Kiev's forces have now claimed they've seized control of 74 settlements, and this has prompted the evacuation of 200,000 people. The surprise incursion has created a real dilemma for Vladimir Putin, according to Joe Biden, the US president, who's now made his first comments on Kiev's operations on Russian soil on Tuesday.
Now, the big question, Roland, for us, I think, is how dramatic is this change? Does it significantly change the balance of the conflict? Ukraine, of course, invaded by Russia. It appeared to be that the whole battle, or 99% of the battle, was on Ukrainian soil. But actually, obviously, if you read the headlines, Roland, it sounds like, wow, Ukraine have invaded Russia back almost. But is that too simplistic a way of looking at this?
No, I mean, it is dramatic. I mean, no matter which way you cut this, this is the first invasion of Russia since the Second World War, right? This is really major stuff. So that's one point. The other point here, regardless of the details on the battlefield and so on, is that the Ukrainians have struggled with their Western allies for a long time about these so-called red lines and the strings that come attached to Western aid, which are basically the strings say, don't use our weapons in Russia, don't take the war into Russia itself, because we're afraid of the war escalating further, of crossing Vladimir Putin's nuclear red lines, for example, of ending up in a NATO-Russia conflict. And Ukrainians have been quite frustrated about this for a very long time, right? And they've been lobbying, saying, look, it doesn't make any sense. We need to be able to hit back. And they have hit back with their own weapons, but they can't fire our Storm Shadows, for example, because those are the conditions that we attach to it. You can't fire it across the border into mainland Russia, excluding Crimea. This has completely changed that dynamic because, in a way, they've called Putin's bluff, right? They've done a ground invasion, they've done plenty of raiding across the border in the past couple of years, plenty of cross-border shelling in the past couple of years. A proper raid by conventional forces on this scale kind of calls that bluff, and it kind of changes the dynamic, and it leaves the Western allies saying, well, hold on a second, maybe you can take the war to Russia, actually. And if you look at the statements coming from German, British, even American kind of leaders, you're seeing them claim that they didn't know this was going to happen in advance, but kind of accepting the fait accompli and refusing to condemn it, kind of making the point that Ukraine has the right to defend itself. It was attacked first. Under international law, it's perfectly acceptable to enter the territory of the aggressor. So that is dramatic, and it's a big change in the war. What this actually means for the military balance of power on the battlefield, that's a whole other question, but that's the major significance.
How does Putin respond? What should Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, do? And is that going to be different from what will he do? Those are two different things.
Is that a moral question?
No, not a moral question. If you were advising him from his point of view, what would he be expected to do? But that may be different, Roland. I'm just exploring. Is that different from what he actually will do or what he's capable of doing? Because one would imagine that he would want to immediately push that incursion back onto Ukrainian soil.
Yeah, I mean,
but it may not be possible for him to do that.
Maybe not immediately. The Ukrainians have set out to create a dilemma for the Russians, and the dilemma is this: Kursk is sovereign Russian territory, right? This is a huge embarrassment. It's obviously hugely vulnerable. The Ukrainians are developing a threat inside Russia. It really has to be addressed. The point of that is, as far as we understand, because the Ukrainians, we should say, have not for a second talked about the actual objectives of this. As part of their operational security, they didn't talk about the plans, they didn't talk about the objectives. We still don't know what the official objectives of the operation are, but we can make a pretty good educated guess. But part of the point is to draw Russian forces away from Donbass, away from the main front line in eastern Ukraine, because that's where the real pressure is. That's where the Russians have been making gains for weeks, months, and where the Ukrainians have been in a pretty desperate situation. So, from the immediate military point of view, if you want to defend Russian territory, yes, you would pull your top units, your VDV, your paratroopers, whoever else, some people out of the line to get them back to Kursk, to confront, plug the hole, contain this incursion, and then push it back over the border. But to do that, you might have to sacrifice the momentum that you're making in Donbass, and Donbass is one of the major objectives. Right? So do you want to fall into the Ukrainian trap and basically risk having to halt that advance where you're making progress, where you're getting close to that stated goal of capturing all of Donetsk Oblast, or do you say no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep on the pressure there, but then you've got to find some kind of forces to respond to this. And what have you got? You've got a bit of a mix. You've got conscripts who technically shouldn't. Russian conscripts doing their national service cannot fight in Ukraine, right? They haven't been deployed in Ukraine. It looks like they're going to be, they have been thrown into combat here. You have FSB border troops. You have Chechen Special Forces.
Sorry, Roland, FSB is?
FSB is the Federal Security Bureau, so that's the main successor to the KGB. And they do all the secret police stuff, but they've also got, they're also responsible for the border guard service. Right? So if you cross the border in Russia, the person who stamps your passport is an FSB officer, right? So they've also got a kind of military wing that is meant to secure the borders. So you got FSB, you got conscripts available, you've got some units that you can pull over from the fight in Kharkiv Oblast, you've got Chechen Special Forces who are technically under the Interior Ministry, so a completely different agency. So you've got a whole mix. You've got to get into an area where you weren't expecting to fight, and you've got to put them under a unified command. Now he's given that job to his right-hand man, Alexei Dyumov. Better check that. The surname. Yesterday. So they've created what they call a counter-terrorism operation. He's given it to one of his very senior rising trusted lieutenants, said he's going to be in charge of everything. Everyone's going to be under his command. And that is obviously an attempt to create some kind of unified command to cope with this thing. We'll have to see. It's not yet quite clear how many troops the Russians are peeling away, if they're peeling away any from Donbass. The Americans have said they think that is happening. And if so, that's probably good news for the Ukrainians, because we think that is part of the intention here, to take pressure off that front.
And as you say, this quite dramatic incursion into Russian territory does create this short-term dilemma for Putin. It's embarrassing for him. He's potentially having to draw troops away. But I wondered, in the longer term, ultimately, do you think this will help to bring about a speedier end to the conflict, or is it just impossible to say?
The short and boring answer is impossible to say. But if we're going to, flesh it out a bit, several objectives they have in mind. One is obviously kind of stretch Russian reserves, draw troops away from Donbass. Another one is clearly taking prisoners, so they can swap them for Ukrainian prisoners. And we've already seen signs. Volodymyr Zelensky, in his address, I think even this morning or maybe last night, was explicit. Like we've captured Russians, and that's part of what he calls the exchange fund. Right? Thank you to everyone who helped replenish the exchange fund, he said. And we've already seen little videos put out on Telegram of captured Russian soldiers, obviously speaking under duress, obviously telling them what the Ukrainian captors told them to say, quite shell-shocked guys, saying, I am, Vladimir Maximovich of the 810th Marine Battalion. I've been captured in battle by Ukrainian forces, and I'd like to request the Russian government to exchange me for Azov prisoners from Mariupol, and they all said that. So I kind of see a coordinated campaign to get the Azov guys who've been held since the Battle of Mariupol in 2022 out. That would be a big propaganda win for Ukraine, also quite a big political win for Volodymyr Zelensky domestically. So there's that. And then this question of talks, right, and how the war is going to end. We always hear this kind of truism that all wars end in negotiated settlements. It's not true. But eventually there will be talks, right? We think, probably. In talks, what you hold on the battlefield really matters, right? So part of the idea may be if we're heading that way, if we're thinking that this year or maybe early next year we're going to be at the negotiating table, if Ukraine is holding part of Russia, that gives them, another card to play.
When we were talking a while ago, there was much more sense that Ukraine was really on the back foot, that Russia, with the winter ahead, the possibility of disrupting energy supply, the grinding ability of Russia to put more men into the field constantly. This does seem to have changed that balance. Maybe not meaning that Ukraine are now on the front foot, but there seems, talking to you, Roland, that Zelensky has at least got a few more chips on. If there is to be a negotiating table, he's got a few more chips on there.
Yeah, I think so, but it's still early days, right? We're just a week. I think we're 8 days into this operation now. We don't know how it's going to pan out, right? And the Ukrainians have also got a dilemma here, right? Do you keep advancing into Russian territory? And part of the advantage the Ukrainians have at the moment is that there's no front line, right? Their assault groups are kind of fanning out over the territory. The Russians can't quite put in a front. They can't pin them down, and keep moving is how they maintain that kind of maneuver warfare, which gives them that advantage. But if you do that, eventually you're going to be, so far in Russia, you're inviting encirclement, destruction. You don't need me to enumerate the well-known historical analogies here. Napoleon, Hitler, Bernard Montgomery's famous quotation, rule 1 on page 1 of the Book of War: never march on Moscow, right? Do you just keep advancing through Russia, or do you try and hold what you've taken? But if you hold what you've taken, it means digging in, and then it means potentially being drawn into the same kind of positional, attritional warfare that we see in Donbass, which basically favours Russia because Russia has more men and more ammunition. Or do you retreat, in which case you preserve the lives of more of your men, which is good for Ukraine. You've probably taken prisoners. You won a moral victory, but are you able to maintain that kind of pressure on the Donbass? You can maintain some kind of threat there.
Roland, just for people who may not have followed the detail that you have on the conflict, what is the significance of the Azov regiment?
So Azov, obviously massively controversial because they're a Ukrainian unit with roots in the extreme far right, basically. They led the defense of Mariupol during the siege there in 2022, quite heroically, to be absolutely honest. They were eventually boxed into a steelworks, besieged, eventually had to surrender, and were held captive. It was a massive propaganda win for the Russians, because the Russians always said, these guys are the Nazis who we're fighting, and so on. And a lot of them are still in Russian prisoners and have not been exchanged. And there's been a big campaign inside Ukraine, a lot of pressure put on the government there about bringing those guys back. So if Zelensky is able to bring some of those guys back, if he can say after this operation, okay, we've got, all of the guys who defended Azovstal are back in the country, I got them out. Frankly, that is a big political win for him domestically, I think, as well as a kind of larger symbolic propaganda win for Ukraine against Russia.
So, Roland, you've been to Kursk, and what can you tell us about it?
It's very hot at this time of year because it's in southern Russia. It's quite dusty. The region is heavily agricultural. It's quite flat. I mean, in places it's flat as a pancake, like this table. In other places you've got these valleys and gullies and marshlands, which is would present more problems for the tanks moving. I was actually there in 2014, and I was sent to look for the Russian invasion force that we were anticipating was going to enter Ukraine, and we didn't find it.
Or Crimea, yes.
It was Crimea, and then we were expecting an invasion, a conventional invasion of Ukraine, and the Telegraph sent me down to look for the rumoured invasion force. I drove all the way through that region where that battle is now taking place. Didn't see a sausage, but it's look, it's flat country. It's good country for mobile tank warfare at this time of year.